I have a family member that got her gallbladder removed. And so she's a little bit afraid of eating fat now. Can someone without a gallbladder eat this type of diet?
Yeah, and in fact, if they had eaten fat before, they wouldn't have had their gallbladder taken out because you need bile, and that's the thing. Again, your body makes a specific amount of bile. That's not an accident. It's actually a very expensive nutrient to make for your body. It costs a lot. And you have 5 organs working together just to absorb fat. So you're making a specific amount of fat, and you have 5 organs working together to absorb that fat. So do you think that nature messed up and that our bodies messed up on a global scale, that our bodies have just no idea how much fat they want, and they're just making a random amount of fat to absorb a random amount of or a random amount of bile to absorb a random amount of fat? That's very unlikely. Your body doesn't do that. Your body makes things in very specific ways. It's very efficient, and it's not just going to make just an arbitrary amount of fat or make or of bile, and it's not going to just make too much bile so you absorb too much fat. That's going to cause physiological stress and harm. So again, you can't overeat fat. You should just eat fat until your body runs out of bile, and that's it. And that's how you know how much fat you're getting. That's how you know if you're eating enough fat. If you're under eating fat, you're going to get constipated, right? Or unless you get protein poisoning, then it can cause watery diarrhea. Or drinking coffee or tea or magnesium supplements and artificial sweeteners, that can cause laxative effect and cover up the fact you're not eating enough fat. But if you eat fat until you run out of bile, that by definition is the right amount of fat. That's how much fat your body wants. And so eating low fat, I'm glad you brought that up, because that can cause other health issues like gallstones. Because when you make bile, you store it in your gallbladder. And this is in physiological textbooks that we learn in medical school, that your gallbladder concentrates that bile and can concentrate it up to 20 times more concentrated than it comes out of your liver. Now, maybe some people are predisposed to concentrating even more than that, or maybe we just, that's how much we have measured, but maybe it goes further than that. And that is because that is so important. And so as predators, we may not get a meal every day. We may not be able to get a kill every day. And so we still need to absorb the same amount of fat. We still have the same requirements for fat, whether or not we make a kill every day. So let's say we make it once a week. We need to have a week's worth of bile concentrated and stored up in our gallbladder. And then we can gorge and eat as much as we need for the week, and we can absorb all that fat. If we just had to get fat every single day and we just ran out of that bile, like you would all die. You wouldn't be able to get enough fat in the wild, because you wouldn't necessarily be, if you missed one day, you'd be knocked back. And one day again, you're knocked back further, and so on. You end up getting malnourished and not able to get enough energy. So if you're not eating for 5 days, you concentrate that bile, and then you eat enough fat, and you can absorb all that fat. If you're not eating fat really at all, you're going to keep that bile there. It's going to keep concentrating, keep concentrating, keep concentrating, keep concentrating. And what does any hyperconcentrated solution do at rest? It forms precipitate. It forms crystals. Anybody who's taken chemistry, even high school chemistry, should know that. And so that precipitate is what we call bile sludge. And the crystals are what we call gallstones. And we say, oh, but they're made out of there's cholesterol in there, and that means you have too much cholesterol in there. Your body's just squirting it out there. Bile is made out of cholesterol. So any crystal or precipitate that's made from that substrate, of course, is going to have those constituent molecules in there, and cholesterol is part of that. So that's not very clever. But so if you don't eat fat, you will get gallstones. Much more likely. Now, some people may be more predisposed to getting, because a lot of people have been avoiding fat, but gallstones have massively increased. And it's the 4S, female, fertile, 40s, and fat. That's the most common demographic that gets gallstones. Okay, so men are more likely to eat fat than women, because men are more hedonistic. And even though we're told fat's bad for you, we go like, screw it, I like it, right? Women are much more likely to do what they're told and say, this is good for me, I'm going to do it. And that's really good if you're getting good advice, but it's not great if you're getting bad advice, like eat low fat. And so what's that common denominator there? You have a woman in her 40s that is childbearing age, she's fertile, and she's overweight. So this is someone who's had a couple of kids, still has some extra baby weight, and is really having trouble losing that weight. And so what do? If you want to lose fat, you have to stop eating fat. That's that same old tired ass advice, which is if you want to lose fat, you have to stop eating fat. Bullshit. You do not want to do that. That is absolute garbage. And that's the same advice that, the primal bot and all these other people are saying now. Fat's bad. Fat's the enemy. Fat makes you fat. No, it doesn't. Carbs make you fat. Insulin makes you fat. I think the primal bot said something about fat raising your insulin. It's the only micronutrient that doesn't raise your insulin. So this again shows you that she's not educated in this field and she really doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just getting this from other people and she's getting it wrong and she's giving people bad advice. That is the only macronutrient that does not elevate your
But
insulin.
she was saying something about eating ribeye steaks increase
Mhm.
your insulin a lot,
No,
which it doesn't make any sense.
no, it doesn't. That is the only thing that doesn't raise your insulin. It's the only thing. You eat a lot of protein, it'll raise your insulin. Sure. And that's what she's telling people to do. But she's also giving people protein poisoning, so they'll lose weight even in spite of the slightly elevated insulin. But the insulin spike you get from protein isn't all that much. And you don't get any insulin spike from eating fat, right? So the thing is that when you are, so it's the same old advice. You want to lose fat, you have to stop eating fat, right? And so that's what people do. So they stop eating fat, and so women stop eating fat. And what happens? They might lose weight. They're starving themselves and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, if you starve yourself, you'll lose weight, but you'll also slow down your metabolism. So when you start eating again, you'll actually gain more weight than you lost. And so you have this yo-yo diet where people are just slowly getting more and more obese and things like that until they actually cut out all of that and start eating enough fatty meat. But at the time, they're told, don't eat fat, so they don't eat fat. And they lose weight because they're starving themselves and they're malnourished, which isn't a great way to lose weight. And then when they, after a few months of this, they're miserable and they're feeling depleted and they're having these cravings and their body's saying, dude, just eat this. And so they have something with fat and all of a sudden they go, oh, and their side hurts. And they say, okay. And they go into the doctor and the doctor says, yeah, you got gallstones. And that's because you eat too much fat, because you've got gallstones, because that comes from cholesterol and things like that. And you eat too much fat, even though they haven't eaten any fat in months. And that's why they have gallstones. And I've seen this in the hospital. People that have gastric sleeve or bypass surgery, things like that, they lose a lot of weight really quickly. And a majority of them will get gallstones. And there's no real reason for this. There's a lot of things that doctors say in really wishy-washy ways that basically means we have no freaking idea what's going on. And so things like, well, it seems to be that there's a metabolic change when someone, loses weight really, really quickly, and have some physiological changes. What are those physiological changes? What are the exact mechanisms, et cetera? You don't know that. You're just using sort of big words that sound doctory, and people just take it for granted. Oh, well, there's just some changes in the processes. There might be. But what you're also doing is you're looking at a population that is really, really determined to lose weight, to the extent that they're willing to mutilate their own body and internal organs in order to achieve this. And it's not necessary. It's not necessary. And it can be quite harmful. But as a result, they're told you don't eat any fat. And they've done all this surgery and they're like, okay, I'm not eating any fat. I'm going to be super strict on this diet. And they will lose weight because it forces them to starve themselves and not absorb their food properly. And so they get malnutrition and they get malnourished and they lose weight, but they're not eating any fat. And then they get gallstones because they're storing their bile and it's concentrating into stones. And there's this one lady who was there. She was very upset. And she came in, she had all the symptoms of gallstones. And she was like, no, it can't be. Absolutely not. I refuse. You need to investigate this. You need to find this out. I was like, okay. So we got her an ultrasound scan. We found, yeah, gallbladder was full of stones. And we gave her the diagnosis. And she just said, look, I'm going to need some time to process this because I have not eaten any fat in over 3 months. None. And so I should not have gallstones. In my head, I was thinking, like, that's why you have gallstones, because that's how that organ works. If you eat enough fat, meaning you eat as much fat as you have bile for, again, as much as your body wants you to absorb, it is not possible for you to get gallstones. Not possible. Now, you might not get gallstones if you don't eat fat, but you cannot get gallstones if you do eat enough fat, because there won't be any bile in your gallbladder in the first place. And you can't make a stone out of nothing. You can't make a stone out of thin air, right? So even if you were someone who would form a stone in a day, which is not compatible with life, You still couldn't, because if you're eating enough fat every single day, there's no fat in your gallbladder. It will not stay there, and it will not be able to turn into a gallstone. And in fact, I have patients that are reversing gallstones. They're actually shrinking their stones and getting rid of their stones on ultrasound. And so they're avoiding surgery. If you've had surgery, that's still okay, because it's not your gallbladder that makes bile, it's your liver that makes bile. But instead of storing it in your gallbladder, it just drips out constantly 24 hours a day. That gets in your small intestine, and you can still absorb fat. Now, you may not be able to absorb as much fat. So if you eat a big meal of fat, a lot of that might go through and give you loose stools. Okay, so if you eat a certain amount of fat and 30 minutes later you're running to the bathroom, okay, that was more fat than you could absorb. So just cut that down, space out those meals, eat the same amount of fat, but just over the course of the day. And it might be you need to eat 4 or 5 meals in a day, and that's okay. But just you still need the same nutrition, you still need the same amount of fat. It's just you need to be able to absorb it too. I would not take something like ox bile, which forces you to absorb fat, and it can force you to absorb more fat than your body wants. And so then you really can overeat fat and have more fat than your body wants. And yes, you will store that. So just let your body do it. Also, many people, in fact, I don't know exactly the proportion, but anyway, a lot of people that have had gallbladder removed, if not most people that have gotten their gallbladders removed, form something called a pseudo gallbladder, which is an outpouching of the common bile duct, which actually works exactly the same as a gallbladder. It just sort of stores that bile and sort of keeps it and holds on to it, and then squeezes it out when you eat fat. So there are many people that, 10, 20 years down the road after having their gallbladder removed, that they can still eat, OMAD, one big fatty meal a day, and have no problem with loose stools. But especially if you've gotten your gallbladder removed very recently, it takes time for a pseudo gallbladder to form. And so even if you will, form one day, I mean, certainly not going to form it the week after you get out of the hospital. And so, just see, and if you're, if someone is had their gallbladder removed, or if you've had your gallbladder removed, just start eating, more and more fat, and see if you're running to the bathroom afterwards. And if you're not, and you're able to eat as much as you want without any issues, great. You have a pseudo gallbladder and you can just eat normally. But if not, then just space it out throughout the day.